Thank you for that warm welcome, making Sis Thuli feel at home. Good evening, Molweni, Goeienaand, Dumelang, friends, colleagues, and students. I'm very pleased to welcome you all tonight to this Vice-Chancellor's open lecture. I often say that the University of Cape Town cannot just be an institution on the hill. This campus belongs to all of us South Africans, and especially to our neighbors in all the communities that make up our city. Tonight's lecture helps to demonstrate that fact because our guest speaker, Professor Thuli Madonsela, has built her life around serving all South Africans, especially those who are marginalized. She has shown how those of us in leadership positions do not have to bend the rules in favor of political power or privilege. Her life is a testimony, in particular, for gender equality and the advancement of women, and for that reason, it is appropriate that she's addressing us during this Women's Month. But Professor Madonsela sets an example of leadership for all South Africans, for all sexual identities, for each of us who is seeking to make a lasting difference in our world. She could be said to embody the principles of the South African Constitution she helped craft. I believe the most important message she provides is that each of us can make a difference. Individuals can stand up to the machinery of power. Government can be restored to its proper role of serving all of us, especially those who are most vulnerable and have the greatest need. We certainly have a long way ahead of us as a democracy. But Professor Madonsela gives us an example of what is possible if we all commit ourselves to this vision. This is why I invited her to speak here tonight, to give us a glimpse of what each of us is capable of in helping to create the world we want our families to live in. The Vice-Chancellor's open lecture was set up to provide an opportunity for anyone, whether they are connected to the university or not, to have the benefit of hearing firsthand from people who have distinguished themselves in their respective areas of expertise, people who inspire us to greatness. An important part of my vision for UCT leadership is to instill a sense of inclusivity, transformation, and excellence within the university community. And for that reason, I'm particularly honored to introduce Professor Thuli Madonsela to you. In 2014, Time magazine named her one of the 100 most influential people in the world and described her as an inspirational example of what African public officers need to be. In 2016, Forbes named her its first African person of the year. Those are just two examples of many similar awards she has received. Professor Thulisile Nomkhosi Madonsela was born in 1962 in Soweto. Her parents, Nomasonto and Bafana, were both informal traders. She obtained her Bachelor of Law degree from the University of Swaziland in 1987. And 3 years later, an LLB from the University of the Witwatersrand. Yes, she's a Vetsy. She then started working as an assistant teacher at her former school, Evelyn Baring High School in Manzini, Swaziland, and taught from 1980 to 1983, giving back to the community she came from. In 1984, she entered the legal profession as a legal and education officer at the Paper Printing Wood and Allied Workers Union, where she worked from 1984 to 1987. Between 1987 and 2009, Professor Madonsela served in government departments, civil society organizations, and academia. She is one of the drafters of South Africa's Constitution and a co-architect of several laws that help to anchor our democratic principles, including, among others, the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, the Employment Equity Act, and the Recognition of Customary Marriages Act. She has lectured law at Wits, presided over the Independent Electoral Commission, worked as Deputy Director at the Justice Department, and held the position of Managing Director at the Office on the Status of Women in the Presidency. She was a full-time member of the South African Law Reform Commission from 2007 until she was appointed as Public Protector in 2009 by President Jacob Zuma for a non-renewable term of 7 years. Of all her high-profile positions that she has held, it is as public protector that she made her mark in the public eye. During her tenure, she made South Africans proud of her courage, unbiased professionalism, and efficiency in her handling of high-profile cases, including the probe into state resources allocated to Jacob Zuma's Nkandla residence upgrade, detailed in her report titled Secure in Comfort, and released in March 2014, and the state capture report released in November 2016. She attracted international praise for her efficiency and professionalism, including recognition by the Daily Maverick, Glamour magazine, media company ANN7, Transparency International, and the BBC. She left the Public Protector's Office on the 14th of October 2016. Today, as Chair for Social Justice in the Law faculty at the University of Stellenbosch, she conducts and coordinates social justice research, teaches constitutional and administrative law, and continues to advocate for ethical governance in public institutions and for public administration that is accountable, transparent, responsive to people's needs. As part of her remit, Professor Madonsela remains involved in civil society initiatives. She is the founder of the Tuma Foundation, an independent democracy leadership and literacy social enterprise, a co-architect and founding chairperson of the African Ombudsman Research Center, and co-founder and one of the inaugural leaders of the South African Women Lawyers Association. She continues to advocate for gender equality and the advancement of women. She has authored and co-authored several publications, including books, chapters, journals, and handbooks on gender management and gender mainstreaming. Her South African and global honors are too numerous to list here, but they include several Lifetime Achievement Awards, including an award by the Premier of Gauteng in 2018, Transparency International's Integrity Award, the German Africa Prize, and the Africa Anti-Corruption Crusader Award. She has honorary Doctor of Law degrees from Wits University, Stellenbosch University, UCT, the University of Fort Hare, Rose University, and most recently, Northwest University. Additional peer recognition includes the South African Law Society's Truth and Justice Award, the Sydney and Felicia Kentridge Award, Botswana Lawyers Association honorary membership, and the Botswana Bar, and the Commonwealth Lawyers Association Truth and Justice Award. She spent a year at Harvard in 2017 as an Advanced Leadership Fellow. She's a Paul Harris Fellow at the Tolbeck Global Leader. A strong signal of her popular appeal is the inclusion of her name in books with titles like An A to Z of Amazing South African Women, published by Mojaji Books in 2017. Inspired Remarkable South Africans Share Their Stories, published by Picador Africa, and Leadership Perspectives from the Frontline, published by Knowledge Resources Publishing, for which she wrote the foreword. Last year, Jonathan Ball published a biography titled No Longer Whispering to Power, the story of Thuli Madonsela, written by Thandeka Qubule. The title comes from the comparison Professor Madonsela once made between her role as public protector and that of a Vavenda traditional spiritual female leader, Vomakadze, who whispers truth to the ruler. When the sounds of the exchanges between the ruler and Vomakadze grow loud, Professor Madonsela said, that is when the whispering has failed. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we are ready to listen to this inspiring Vomakadze. Vomakadze's words of truth to the topic education and the complex shadow of our unjust past. Please join me in welcoming Professor Madonsela to the podium.
Vice-Chancellor Pakeng, thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be here tonight. Dear colleagues, greetings and happy Women's Day. Well, happy Women's Month. Sorry. Education and the complex shadow of our past. We've just had the Vice-Chancellor of a premier global university, which is what you are, isn't it? Like us, Stellenbosch, you're a premier global university, not just a South African university. We've just had her speak. Professor Pakeng is celebrated as South Africa's first black female to get a PhD in mathematics, having acquired it in 2002. In addition to the fact that we got the first black female mathematician or mathematics PhD almost a decade into democratic South Africa, current mathematics statistics are frightening. Professor Zahida Vali quotes results from the 2015 Trends in International Maths and Science study, that's a TIMSS study. That study shows that only 48% of black grade 3 learners pass mathematics, whilst 85% of white learners succeed in passing the same. She says since educational outcomes directly determine labor market participation, black parents with low levels of education are victims of sustained unemployment, quoting S. Paul from Stellenbosch University. Vali also says that of the top 200 schools in the country, 185 are former white schools. She also makes a remarkable observation that the top performing schools in this country tend to be the fee-paying schools. You do know that we have two kinds of schools. The ones parents are so happy that they don't have to pay anything for. But now it says that those are at the bottom when it comes to performance. Professor Vali says, while race was a determining factor of education opportunity during apartheid, nowadays both race and class are key determinants. She explains this as follows. She says 84% of grade 5 learners attending independent schools can do basic mathematics in accordance with international norms, compared to 67% in fee-charging public schools and only 25% in no-fee public schools. She then says it's clear that fee-paying schools drive the inequality wedge. Even further, between the majority of black learners and other races who are privileged enough to be attending well-resourced fee-charging schools. I know, for example, in Stellenbosch, everyone wants their child at Paul Roos Gymnasium. Unfortunately, there aren't enough spaces. It's also said that fee-charging schools also attract higher qualified educators. And of course, the no-fee schools attract those who have nowhere else to go. I know for a fact that there are even schools that don't teach mathematics because there's no one to teach it. My nephew went to 2 schools in KwaZulu-Natal where they don't teach mathematics because there's no one to teach it. That means automatically you can't go into any stream in life where maths is required. You can't go into medicine, you can't go into SET. I mean, as a lawyer, I also think that to be able to think logically as a lawyer, you must understand maths. And my colleague, Professor Neil Turok, agrees that maths should be taught to law students. They shouldn't be given the lower quality mathematics because reasoning requires logical thinking and mathematics gives you that grounding. But we've heard a little bit about having a first maths PhD in 2002 starts about disparities in maths facilities and performance at schools. How about university, where we are right now? When my daughter was studying at the University of Pretoria, she found a young man who was living in a library inside the toilet. That was his dormitory. His name was Jackson. And they started a campaign called I Am Jackson because they discovered that there were many like Jackson, and they spoke to the university, got them accommodation, and got them to be properly registered. And it's amazing to think that eventually Jackson became an SRC member, and he now has his degree. But the I Am Jackson campaign was a harbinger of what became a Fees Must Fall campaign. Many of the students who were sleeping in bathrooms and other places had only registered, they only had 5,000 rand for registration. Jackson, for example, didn't have food. He ate a loaf of bread for a whole week with water. And on certain days, one of the ground staff members would give him milk. And the ground staff members also helped them with laundry. Science tells us that performance is not just about working hard, it's about sleeping properly and eating properly. And here was Jackson, expected to perform with no proper sleep and zero nutrition. The interesting thing is that the staff members that were providing Jackson and others with food, whatever little food they could provide, were themselves at the bottom of the food chain at the university. They couldn't study because studying subsidies are only given to full-time staff members, not the outsourced staff, ground workers. So those who can afford get the subsidies. Those who can't afford get subsidies. I don't know one university that provides subsidies for studying to ground workers or to general workers. But what is the color of those general workers? And what cycle does it reproduce? But most universities also provide subsidies for children of staff members. As far as I know, or at least at that university where Jackson was, those subsidies were not provided to general workers, including ground workers, which meant these parents were going to be poor and the next generation is going to be poor. And many of them were paid a little bit more than the NSFAS threshold at the time, which meant they couldn't go into NSFAS and they couldn't pay for themselves. So this relationship between students and general workers formed the crucible for what became an Outsourcing Must Fall campaign, which was really about making sure that general workers are integrated in the fabric of the life of a university or government institution, and hopefully they get the benefits that others get. Education infrastructure, particularly accommodation for tertiary studies, is a major national challenge. I've just spoken about the Jackson story. But what me and you need to understand, though, is that the problem of accommodation in tertiary institutions does not affect everyone the same. For example, when my daughter was studying at the University of Pretoria, we were living within walking distance from the University of Pretoria, and we had a car. Because my daughter got a couple of straight A's at high school, the university deemed that she deserves one of the best accommodation places. I think universities have to explain to me, what's the link between good grades and accommodation? Because when I was studying, you got accommodation on the basis of need. So those with cars, those who live in the neighborhood would be considered last. But now, my daughter, who lives literally within a walking distance from the university, and we had a car, had accommodation because she had good grades. And she got one of the good ones, Clara Dane, very, very good residence. I could not understand it. She could not understand it. That's why she was horrified when she discovered Jackson. In fact, at some stage, she had one of those ladies living with her, and later we had her come to live at our house until her accommodation could be sorted out. There's no guessing, of course, that the shortage of accommodation around institutions of higher learning affects primarily the poor, because they don't have cars, they don't have money to get good accommodation elsewhere. But thirdly, apartheid spatial disparities would mean that the homes of some people will be closer to the university, whilst the homes of others will be furthest from the university, which creates further disparities. Even if people come to live with relatives, people are more likely to have relatives that live if in Pretoria, in Mamelodi, if here, maybe in Kayamandi, Khayelitsha, etc., which is far away from libraries, Wi-Fi, and everything that you need for university. Whilst on infrastructure, we're also still reeling from the shock of learners like Gomape, who have died from pit latrines in basic education environments. We have a systemic challenge of the paucity of infrastructure in township and rural schools, where majority of black children attend. One of the schools we went to with the Tutu Foundation, we found that they were learning without desks. Literally, we brought them desks, the Tutu desk. But in addition to that, they would have 3 or 4 classes learning in one classroom. I still don't know how they do that. Where some are learning English, some are learning biology at the same time, and another group is doing maths with different teachers in one room. I don't know how they do that, but that's the reality of township education. I've just given you statistics of race and class, but there's gender disparities, there's disability disparities. We have a history in this country of putting children with disabilities in separate schools. The UN now requires them to study in normal schools because they're going to live in society. They're not going to live separately. But that still continues. When it comes to girls, while statistics show that girls now do fairly well at high school, they're still underrepresented in science, engineering, and technology, studies, and occupations. What are we to make of this? Let's take Professor Pakeng being the first Black woman PhD recipient. Does it mean there were not enough Black women to accomplish that before 2002? How is that possible, given the fact that the first Black African woman in this country who got a BSc degree got it in 1901, Charlotte Manya Maxeke, at the age of 20. Curiously, the entry in Wikipedia, and I do know lawyers are going to say Wikipedia is not a good reference, but there is an entry there in Wikipedia that says that Maxeke excelled in mathematics. So why are historically Black schools doing badly in maths? Why are women not fairly represented in SET? Why are people with disabilities confined to certain areas of education? Why do we have a rural-urban divide when it comes to resourcing of schools, which of course translates into historically white and historically Black? I invite you to ask the question, does this have anything to do with the shadow of our past? Does it? Because others say no, the problem is corruption. Maybe. The problem is bad policies? Maybe. But we have a great constitution, and does it not provide an adequate response to the shadow of our past? If so, why has it not addressed that shadow in the last 25 years of democracy? Could we have done better? And if we continue along the lines we have fared up until now, what's at stake? These are some of the questions I would ask us to think about today and think about in the next couple of days. And I would also want you to think about these questions as we host a National Social Justice Summit, an international conference, on the 29th, 30th, and the 31st of this month. It is said that we have one of the best constitutions in the world. And one of the greatest aspects of that constitution is the vision of society that it has. For example, Justice Leonora Theron reminds us that the Constitution in this country's, or the Constitution is this country's proudest and most prized possession. In its preamble, it recognizes our past of injustices that left us a legacy of vast inequality and social inequity. It bravely declares its supremacy and its object, which is to usher in a system based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. And it most crucially holds itself to be the foundation upon which such a society is to be realized. The Constitution addresses this by obliging us to strive for equality as a founding value. The Equality Clause of the Constitution requires that citizens should not only be entitled to all rights and freedoms, but should also be able to fully and equally enjoy them. I have a copy of the preamble here, which talks about we the people recognize the injustices of our past, honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land, respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. We therefore, through our freely elected representatives, adopt this Constitution as the supreme law of the Republic to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. Lay the foundation for a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by law. To improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person, and build a united and democratic South Africa, able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations. May God protect our people, Nkosikeleli Africa, Morena Buluka, Sishaba sa Yesu. You will agree with me that the achievement of equality and human dignity means very little to those left behind, as the statistics I've mentioned earlier reflect. So maybe let's talk a little bit about the past and its persistent shadow. In his judgment in the case of Daniels versus Scribante, Justice Edwin Cameron, who retired yesterday, says the following: "The past is not done with us. This is not past. It will not leave us in peace until we have reckoned with its claim to justice." The grandson of H.F. Verwoerd, who is regarded as the architect of apartheid, Willem Verwoerd, quotes her neighbor as saying the following about our education system. Her neighbor says, she's an African woman, "Not experiencing Bantu education helped me a lot. Verwoerd's reason was, don't let them get educated, because if they're educated, you will not be able to subdue them." So that was the past. That at some stage in our history, after Charlotte Maxeke had been educated, after Pixley Kaseme had been educated, and many others had been educated, including my mother, the education system was changed. And if you read the chapter, we have extracted this. Verwoerd's neighbor, that is Willem's neighbor, explains the difference between those who went under apartheid after Bantu education and those who didn't. That's why she says, thank God she didn't go through it, because her parents sent her to Lesotho and my parents sent me to Swaziland. In Head of Department, Education Free State versus Welcome High School and another, the Constitutional Court says, among other things, the following: "The entrenchment of the right to education as a fundamental right of all people in South Africa represents a remarkable and ambitious break with the past. Occurring as it does in the wake of the apartheid regime's policy of racially segregated, disproportionately resourced schooling, and the very real legacy of that noxious system which we are still faced today. I would like to reread that. The entrenchment of the right to education as a fundamental right of all people in South Africa represents a remarkable and ambitious break with the past, occurring as it does in the wake of the apartheid regime's policy of racially segregated, disproportionately resourced schooling, and the very real legacy of that noxious system with which we are still faced today. Do you agree with me that we're still faced with the legacy of the past? But the shadow of our past is not just in terms of disparities in resources. There's also the mentality it inculcated. And there's two things that I would like us to think about in terms of the mentality. The first thing is it messed us all, because our education was based on 19th century Taylorism. Those of you who have done sociology would know that Taylor is the guy who decided that the workplace needed to be so efficient in such a way that some people's job would be just to plonk something into the system. You didn't need to know what the rest of the system was, because it was it was preparing us for the second and third industrial revolution. So mostly everyone has been educated to be a cog in a machinery. For example, entrepreneurship is taught to people as a knife to teach. Arts and craft were taught to my kids. I remember myself as just a nice to do. You do it in one class. You don't even continue with it. You do a different thing this year. It doesn't matter what you are good at. The next year you're doing something else, because it was supposed to be a pastime. It wasn't seen as part of different pathways to being a human being and to adding value to humanity. So 19th century education in 21st century South Africa and in the 21st century world is at odds with the needs of our society, where innovation is necessary, where not everyone is supposed to be a cog in a machine. In South Africa, for example, the education system needed people to go to the mines, to be uneducated, so that they could go to the mines and do manual labor. So it was short of lobotomizing people, but creating those kinds of people, just soldiers on the shop floor. And how much of it have we changed, though, to make sure that we have innovative people, critical thinking people, and people who are ready to employ themselves in villages, in townships, in the urban areas? How much of it is creating problem solvers? Some it does, because teachers with their own innovation, they add these things, but the broader system is lagging behind. It's not aligned with the 21st century. But people are talking about teaching people for the fourth industrial revolution. You need to align the whole education system with the challenges of our time. We no longer need an army of people in factories. We need critical thinking people who can innovate and who can operate independently when need be. And of course, in the black, insofar as the black and white divide, there's another area of education we never think about when we just think about disparities: the psyche that it created. And I think Willem Verwoerd talks about it a little bit in his book, Verwoerd. I remember when my son was doing grade 4, going to his school and asking his principal, "What is my son? Is he a dangerous thing, or is he part of the people?" Because, we have to do homework with our children. So I had to do homework with my children. And so there was a passage there in history that was talking about when the people were trekking into the inland, they were faced with many dangers. Snakes, wild animals, and natives. So on the one hand, you had the people nicely trekking into the inland. On the other hand, you had dangerous things, which included natives. So I asked Mr. Pretorius, very nice fellow, and he said, no, he doesn't prepare these things. They're prepared from the Department of Education. So he couldn't help me. Well, I went to another school, Waterkloof Primary. I found that no, they didn't teach history that way. So that's why I talk about teachers can innovate. And then I moved my son there. But how many other schools continued to teach like that? What psyche did it create among the children who felt they were neither people nor dangerous elements in their own heads? But who were they then? What about the children who were told to fear dangerous things that included snakes, wild animal? And this was, my son is part of the millennials. So if I'm talking about what was happening, this was well into democratic South Africa. It was happening in Stellenbosch Primary in Pretoria. So that psyche has stayed with us, and people like Pumla Kobodo, Matikizela Kobodo, my colleague, talk about our collective woundedness, our collective trauma. In the past, the education system was part of creating that trauma. But have we used education enough as a tool to address that woundedness? And if we don't do so, what will address this woundedness? Because they say when trauma is not dealt with, it is transmitted into something else. Is it possible that the reason Bell Pottinger had an easy time dividing us was because Bell Pottinger fed into that trauma? It was easy to gaslight us, white monopoly capital campaign, and even today, there's still those Twitter boards that are still hanging on to that. So that's part of the national psyche. But it also doesn't help that we have the haves and have-nots. 55.5% poverty in our country is a dangerous thing. But wait, amongst Africans, Black Africans, poverty is at 64.2%. In the colored community, it's about 48%. Indian community, I think it's about 5%, in white community, 1%. And again, those patterns may have something to do with the shadow of the past. So we have a poverty trap. We have a poverty epidemic. Why do I say poverty is both a trap and an epidemic? The trap is that when you're poor, you're more likely to stay poor. And one of the articles that I read, which I haven't referenced properly here, says that people who are poor today, who are born into a poor family, only 2% are likely to escape the poverty trap. In the past, you could promise people, just globally, social mobility, that if you work hard enough, you will be lifted out of poverty. But people lie to us when they say, just by working hard and studying, you're going to be lifted out of poverty. That's a lie. And I've written about it, about the monopoly board, that if you're in a monopoly board and some people are already on the board and they've taken up residence on the board, and then other people are excluded and they join whilst already everything has been taken, breaking through is impossible. So why have I broken through? Why has the VC broken through? Why have many of you women broken through despite of the fact that we were discriminated? You will find that all of us who have broken through, somebody opened the gap for us. Somebody lifted you. Let's take me. Born in Johannesburg, raised in Soweto, father a former farm worker turned laborer, a mother a former domestic worker who is now an informal trader. Get educated. My father says at grade 10, you're far more educated than you should be. Because my father thought you should be educated enough to be able to take instructions from white people. So Verwoerd had done a good job in educating my father about what was going to be my role in society. But my father then thought, well, you're not even going to take instructions now. You can go and study nursing at Baragwanath Hospital, and he sorted out everything for me. My mom, on the other hand, had been adopted by missionaries, and she dropped out of school in standard 6 then because she wanted good clothes. And she regretted it ever since. So she insisted that we should get educated. When my father couldn't take me further, my mother knew that missionaries or church people can always assist, and went to my headmaster at Evelyn Baring High School and asked if I could get a bursary, and the headmaster got a bursary from some of the churches that were funding us. And when I went to university, I got a bursary from the United Nations, which was monies collected from Europe. But you can see all of that it is strangers stepping in. When I went to university, for example, there was a guy by the name of John Daniel. He had been part of NUSAS here and had been banned for fighting against apartheid. But what he did when he got to Swaziland, he made sure that between Swaziland, Lesotho, and Botswana, because it was BLS at the time, no child from South Africa would end up without an education simply because they had no money. All you needed to do was rock up, get a place at university, and John Daniel will find a place for you. And so you can see that somebody opened the space for me. And I can talk about having been part of drafting the Constitution, people like Frini Chinala, Mavivi Manzini, and all of the women that had been involved with us in formulating ideas about the Constitution, even before the formal Constitution drafting process, let me in. So what does it mean? It means without people who are already privileged, who are in the inner circle, opening up and pulling people in, it's not going to happen. And when it comes to education, the poverty trap tends to make people who are poor find themselves in the same space, which becomes an epidemic. So let me just quickly, though, look at how have we dropped the ball. Why do we still have these terrible statistics today? Schools without toilets, fees must fall, etc. I would say there is a clear discrepancy between the constitutional entrenchment of the value of achieving equality in society and how we have progressed. Let's take the South African Schools Act. Does it treat schools differently? No, except for the no fees part. But I remember that during the dying days of apartheid, there was a statistic that says for every R4 invested in a white child, R1 is invested in a black child. So if we are to come up with new education policy and now invest the same amount, inequalities we're going to proceed, isn't it? It's like the story that a Harvard friend told of us of kids wearing blue and kids who were asking about why is there preferential treatment, and their parents were not happy about it. And the school made them wear blue and pink and then asked the blues to run as fast as they can whilst the Pinks stayed, and then later then said the Pinks should join, and the Pinks complained about discrimination. Because it doesn't matter how fast the Pinks would run, maybe a Wade van Niekerk would catch up with the slowest of the Blues, but maybe Custer too, if they don't chop her ability, could catch up with the Blues, but the majority of them are not going to catch up. It's just the nature that you have, mathematically, it's not going to happen. You've got to disrupt the inequality. But our education process has not disrupted the inequality. University education, the same thing. The only thing that we did, we came with NSFAS, but we didn't think about what are we going to do with accommodation for people who are coming from far away. How are we going to invest in that? What about, I know, for example, a lady who went to Stellenbosch who said for her, if it wasn't a system they had at the time, which they don't have anymore, they had a system for first-time university students. She came from KZN, and for her, when she came there, it was an urban jungle. She struggled to adjust. So you'll find a person who was an A student suddenly failing because they are failing to adjust. And do we always have those systems to help them? In this particular case, the lady who's now a winemaker found that system that took into account first-time university students, or first-generation university attendance. But I'm sure the rest of you here would say blaming the past alone is not good enough. So the shadow of our past is the primary reason education is not yielding the results of freeing the potential of every person and improving the quality of life of every person. Corruption, though, has added, maladministration has added, lack of governing capacity has added, but lastly, there's been apathy from business and society. If you look at how I got educated, it's because strangers dug into their pocket and put money into the system. Churches collected this money. There's still a few people who do that, but I think we're not doing enough. And not just in terms of how many people we cover, it's also in terms of what we cover. For example, for us, when I was a student on scholarship, my means were not different from the other students. Now, the NSFAS ones, they don't even have money to buy Vaseline because they just get food. I also know that NSFAS, if you don't get accommodation at university and you're going to live with relatives in the township or with your family, they don't give you anything, which doesn't make sense because you still need money for transport, you still need money for food whilst you're at school. They say you're going to eat whatever your family has. But do you know that some families in the townships go for 3 days without meals? Hunger is a reality in this country and elsewhere in the world. So those policies are not adequately responding to the legacy of our past. But what can be done? Well, what can be done? One is lawfare, Section 27, equal education, have sued government and they've changed some things. If you're not going to do lawfare, the public protector, which is administrative accountability, some people have come to us as the public protector. I remember Ruth then, who was the head of our unit here in the Western Cape, once went to literally measure the distance between a school and a child's place. When the school said the child had been excluded because he lived furthest from the school, Ruth then confirmed that this child applied earlier than some of the other children that got the place. And then it was the distance thing. He literally went there and measured it and found that the school was not being honest with us and enforced them. So things like the pub protector. In the Eastern Cape, we had a case where the children needed toilets. We wrote a report insisting that they should prioritize those toilets. In Northern Cape, when they closed down schools because of problems in the community, roads in the community, infrastructure, and poverty alleviation, we went in to negotiate on behalf of the students, and we did that in the Northwest as well. But another thing that has made a difference is public protest. Sometimes people protest, and there's some social accountability. I think the greatest difference, though, is being made by those who are leveraging privilege to make a difference. How many of you know about Partners for Possibility? If you are a CEO or executive, please join them, because they're saying, yes, we're not where we're supposed to do. Yes, government could do better, but the reality is we have a problem right now, and within us we have the power to solve it. What they do is they have a leadership development program that pairs a school principal in a struggling school with an executive or CEO from a successful business or from a successful government. And they've done 1,000 schools by now. And if they could be assisted to do all of the schools, that would be one problem solved in terms of school governance, because they found that a whole lot of things depend on leadership. So if they fix governance and leadership, it translates or it cascades into everything. They also use those relationships to mobilize resources for those schools. So Partners is one example. So Partners for Possibilities is Louise van Rey. She's historically white, and the people she leverages are principally people from the white community. But you can't say you're too poor to make a difference. Lindiwe, who owns Africa Teen Gigs, has decided that we don't need to have only one mathematician, PhD, once every 10 years. She's decided that when it comes to the fourth industrial revolution, she's not going to complain, she's going to fix it. So she's teaching kids coding, prioritizing rural and township schools, and she's adopted one of our schools in KZN where we are doing an enterprise in communities initiative is Stellenbosch University and Tuma Foundation. So that's one initiative, that's one example where people are doing something. The Sustainability Institute, where Willem Verwoerd is, and our colleague, the Sustainability Institute is also doing something that is like a fresh start in life, a fair start in life, making sure that every child gets a good foundation in terms of ECDC centers and fix the education system. So that's one example. And Richard Mabaso has something called Imbumba. Imbumba is what rural communities used to do as part of Ubuntu. When somebody was ill and they couldn't do their own harvesting or their own sowing, or whatever it is they needed to do in agriculture, they got helped. So there's a lot that can be done. And Georgetown University Initiative is something very interesting. I don't know how many of you have heard about the Georgetown University Initiative in America. That's one example of what could be done. They decided that Georgetown was about to be closed because it had a debt. And then they sold slaves to save that beautiful university. So Georgetown is built on slavery. And this bothered students, young ones, of all color. They discussed this, they eventually voted on it, and they decided that they were going to add a small amount to their fees so that they could collect the children of the slaves or the grandchildren of the slaves and give them an education. So that's restitution, voluntary restitution, that doesn't have to come from the law. It is just people doing the best they can. And one of our students, I see students, Ambassador Mumisa, she calls herself, that her real name is Heidi Lee. No. She's decided, she's just one student. She's decided she doesn't have a lot of resources, but she has some resources. She has a car, she has the ability to teach how to drive, and she wants to teach people how to drive. And she started with a domestic worker. And it has made all the difference. What am I saying to you, dear colleagues? I am saying that we can do better. We need an approach to growth in our economy and in our development as a country that balances growth and inclusion. The IMF says that if we exclude women, we retard growth. But imagine if you're not just excluding women, you're excluding 90% of your population. You're retarding your own growth. So leaving others behind is not just a human rights issue, a social justice issue. It is a development issue. It is an economic issue. And from our side, from the University of Stellenbosch, inviting UCT to join us, Wits is on board, Free State is on board, and I think Walter Sisulu is on board. We're trying to push something that is called a Musa plan for social justice. Just getting every South African behind a project that is about advancing inclusive economic growth. Part of it is about policy reform, leveraging data analytics to plan better. Because when you treat everyone the same, one size fits all drops other people behind. A whole lot of our policies are exacerbating inequality, so that's part of it. But part of it is also social accountability to make sure that all of the resources that we already have are used properly. So all of us, being the eyes and ears of society, to make sure that government uses the money it already has properly. Social cohesion, working together, making sure people understand how government works, making sure that people understand human rights, making sure that we go around, particularly with students, teaching people about their rights, and in the process, promoting the idea of working together. We're also looking at mobilizing resources through the retail sector. Hopefully, South Africans will be prepared to pay something like R5 every time they buy to build a community trust. So the social justice M plan is for social justice, particularly poverty and inequality, targeting 2030 in all areas of life, but it will prioritize areas like education, health, the economy, etc. So what is to be done, dear colleagues? I, for one, believe that it takes a nation to build a successful nation. I know people are writing left, right, and center to say President Ramaphosa is a ruse. He promised us a new dawn, and the new dawn is fading away. You have been members of teams. I've never heard of any team that only depends on the captain or the coach. In every team, everyone has to pool resources. And sometimes the captain does not provide answers. The captain harnesses answers from the team. I would be happier if South Africans are saying we put solutions on the table and the president is declining them. But when it comes to education, President Nelson Mandela said that it is a great weapon for changing humanity. So that's an area that we'll have to invest in, changing minds, in changing fortunes, in building social cohesion. I do believe, though, that it's beginning to happen, but in isolated areas. The idea is, how do we connect our lives? How do we collaborate? How do we make sure that the lights all over the place combine to create a galaxy of stars? President Nelson Mandela's generation and the women of 1956 that we celebrate this month gave us democracy. What will my generation, the millennial generation, and the Z generation deliver? I, for one, believe that social justice and climate change are the most pressing challenges of our time. And they're not going to be solved by presidents. They're going to be solved by you, me, and all of us. Thank you.
Ra leboha Sis Thuli. It's like a call to action when we need it. The country needs a voice that reminds us of our responsibilities. You described the problem, you shared it from your personal experience, and you appropriately challenged us to not just look at what's the problem, but to take our place and do what we need to do. Colleagues, I'm going to invite you, if you have any questions. We asked Professor Madonsela if she'd be willing to take questions, and she said she is. So I'm going to invite you to ask questions. What I'm going to do, because I can see that we don't have much questions, time is 7:45, so I'm just going to take, I see 2, I want to see the third, because I just want to take 3 questions and that's it. And then I'll give Professor Madonsela to respond. Okay, all right, so we're going to start with Nari this side. Okay, there's Nari, there's 3, 4. Okay, those are the only ones I'm taking. Don't raise your hand when you hear the other question, all right? Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Prof, for the lecture. During your lecture, I felt at some point I had hope of certain things that you spoke about, and then you kept on referring to the issue around the system, disrupting the system in a manner or in a way things are structured or they function. And you said sometimes that requires a bit of will and a bit of constructive thinking. Now, just looking at how the situation is, not only within the education system in the country, but around other issues as well. Do you think perhaps we don't have leaders that are brave enough, or are perhaps in a way willing, to interrupt that system in a certain way, so that we can see maybe things changing positively and at a rate that will maybe be acceptable to many of us? Thank you.
Sister Thuli, I want to take all of them so that, yeah. Thank you very much. We'll take the next one. Don't give too much of an explanation. Just get to the question.
Thanks, Prof.
Napo.
You're changing my life again.
Napo, go ahead.
Thanks, Prof. Look, you said something about playing in a team and coming together and being able to affect change. So you were in a situation where we're millennials ourselves, and we're not sure about the shadow of the past and all those, and you find that there's some arrogance attached to not knowing, and I like what you said about the apathy that comes from the business sectors and the private sectors as well. I'm curious about, there's a quote that someone said, and he was quoting Mandela, and he's saying, Mandela used to push a motion that says both black and white need to come together and think about a future where their kids can live together. Now, we're in a situation where we need to think and strategize on social justice. And for me, my question is, what do you do when you have different participants not coming together and saying, look, this is what we acknowledge as our past. And you get loggerheads where you're trying to come together and say, come, let's and extend a hand of invitation and say, let's think about this matter. But now you get a sense of, I was not there, I'm not part of this thing. And this is what you get with us millennials, that I was not there, I was not part of the social injustice, I was just born the way I was. So what do you do now to extend that and ensure that that person becomes a participant in the social justice? Thank you.
Thank you. There was someone next to you.
Good evening, Professor. Thank you so much for coming to address us. I have a question. Now, in many universities, we find that there are people of color and there are women who occupy positions of leadership. UCT is no exception, given that 3 of our DVCs and our Vice-Chancellor are all women, right? But what's interesting is that in elite universities or previously advantaged universities, such as UCT, such as Stellenbosch, a certain culture and a certain way of thinking is still perpetuated, whereby we're not looking at poor people and their interests, we're not looking at the interests of women, but we have people of those demographics in positions of leadership. Now my question is it enough to change the race, the gender of the people in power? And why is it that those people, despite occupying those positions of power, are either unable or, I don't know what, to disrupt or change the culture of that university to be so elitist? Thank you.
Thank you. Last one at the back.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And mine is not necessarily a question, but basically just a word of appreciation for what you've been doing for our country. And in expressing that appreciation, it's actually a portrait of yourself and Dr. Chief Justice Mogoeng, and would just like to present it to you if that's okay.
I had to check the art and the gentleman carefully whether it's Rasta or not. You know. It's not Rasta. We are fine. We are fine, colleagues. This is beautiful. Thank you very much. Can you come and answer?
Thank you. That was unexpected and super kind of you, sir. I really appreciate it. I will treasure this. And the fact that you have put the Chief Justice, who I respect and value a lot, enhances the warm feeling, the warm and fuzzy feeling that comes from the painting. The first question was about leadership. How do we make the leaders we have do the right thing? Dear colleagues, the leaders we're looking for are us. There are no other leaders. A society rises or falls depending on leadership. But leadership is not just top leadership. It's leadership at all levels. I'm a Christian. I believe that when Jesus was on earth, he took a human form. I'm not saying the other religions are bad, and I respect them as well, but I'm just giving you an example that he could lead at the age of 13. He didn't say he had to wait until he was 33 to do the right thing. So honestly, the leaders we are looking for are us, and you've got to start leading. Tell me that you have asked them to do one thing and they haven't done it. And tell me that you have led, you have started doing something and somebody stopped you. The South Africa we dream of is going to come from us. And when you speak about institutions, I think, from this side you see it. What about those in institutions that are unable to transform fast enough and adequately? Institutions by their nature are systems. They don't move overnight. The one institution that I work with might be seen differently by students or by some students than I see it, but I hope the social justice ambassadors who are here with us see it the way I see it. There's true commitment to transformation. Every step is being taken to change the institution, from visual redress to inclusion to move for food when it comes to students who are facing the hunger problem. And our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Thuli, who was a dean here at some stage at the medical school, doesn't lead from behind. He doesn't point fingers and say, you go, I'll see you there. He goes there himself. And I was speaking to the DVC academic, Professor Kluter. One of the things he says to everyone, doesn't matter where your privilege comes from, whether it comes from the fact that you're a man or it comes from the fact that you are enabled, you're not classified as disabled, or it comes from wealth, wherever it comes from, is whatever you can do to lift someone every day, do it. And we're discussing today about what people talk about as the Starfish Project, where people do nothing because they feel what I can do is not going to make a huge difference. But there's a story that is told about a man who was throwing starfish that had beached themselves back into the sea. And somebody came and said, what a useless thing you're doing, because these things beach themselves. And there's too many of them. Anyway, some of them are going to die. He took one and threw it the furthest he could go and said it makes a difference to this one. So imagine if all of us were to do something. I know South African Women in Dialogue, Mama Zanele's group, the people who nominated me to be Power Protector, they've decided that all women who can pay 100 rand, they're targeting women. Historically, women are a historically disadvantaged group. But many of us are now advantaged in some way or another. And they're just asking women to pay, they're trying to find 1 million women that can pay 100 rand each to raise 100 million, which they're going to push into municipalities that are the poorest. Because one of the mistakes we make with development is we keep sending coal to Newcastle. Of the 4,392 municipalities, the poorest get nothing because nobody has NGOs there. Nobody knows the people in those municipalities. They're trying to do that. So that was, your question, Sir, was how do we make the people who are apathetic understand the shadow of the past? Through education and engagement, sir. Because we haven't done that in the last 25 years to educate people about how the past impacts the present. The engagement happens on Twitter, where people are called 1652s, land thieves, etc. So when you do that, people close up, people become defensive. When it comes to gender, people say men are trash. I mean, that makes people clap together and say, we're not trash. We need to find ways. At the Tuma Foundation, they've got something called demologues, where they invite people and talk about these issues. Whatever impacts on democracy is called democracy dialogues, but young people call them demologues. At Stellenbosch University, these young ones have started something called a social justice cafe. In fact, it's coming here tomorrow to the University of Cape Town. It's about engaging on difficult conversation over a cup of coffee, literally. And then the conversations are supposed to be curated in an impartial way, in a manner that encourages everyone to say what they have to say. And we've heard that. Even people who don't believe there's gender, there's rape, for example, rape culture, people who don't believe there's a shadow of the past, you engage them. And we're seeing people shift. We're seeing people say, this is what happened. I've spoken to young people in very privileged schools like Hilton, Bishops, etc. My message to them has been consistent. You didn't ask to be privileged, but you are. Embrace this privilege. Don't feel guilty about it. But look for ways in which you can use that privilege to advance others. And I found that actually, even before I said that, those colleges are already doing that with these young people. They're confirming to them that you're privileged. Because even if you come from a poor background, if you have made it to Hilton College, you now are more privileged than your colleagues in the township. I know, for example, a kid who's at Harvard who was assisted. I spoke about somebody pulling someone. So somebody, Justin Foxton, helped this young person apply for a scholarship in Harvard. He's at Harvard. He is poor, and he just decided that what he's going to do is collect workbooks, old books, for children in the villages where he comes from. So that's his contribution. Nobody's being asked to do more than they can do. So Budi, let's have these conversations, organize social justice cafe, have somebody who is impartial, preferably somebody who doesn't suffer too much from trauma from the past. Because people who suffer from traumas themselves of having been racially degraded or gender degraded, they tend to wound others. So have somebody who can be neutral to curate that conversation in a manner that encourages dialogue. And with time, we'll find each other and we'll find common ground. But just lastly, take responsibility. I met someone today who I think is my hero. Sisi, I'm not going to mention your name, but you touched me. That women are historically disadvantaged. People with disabilities are historically advantaged. Poverty has historically disadvantaged others more than others. How are we going to get the South Africa for our dreams will start with each person firstly taking responsibility for their own advancement, and then finding people who can assist. We've got something that's called enterprising communities that encourages people to be their own liberators. And my dear sister here, who I don't want to embarrass you in public, she was excluded from the education system by poverty and many things that happened in her family. She stood up. She didn't complain about democracy having not sorted her out. She stood up. She reached out to us, and I'd never met her. We just helped where we could help. And today, she's on a pathway to educating herself. And I think that's the spirit that we have to inculcate, a spirit of using the power of dreams and getting everyone to get on the education bandwagon. And where we can assist them, stretch a hand to lift them. Thank you.
Professor Madonsela, thank you very much for first accepting our invitation, honoring us with your presence, but more than that, being who you are in our country, especially now. I hope you realize how your life and how you go about what you do touches people. Not through the lectures you give, but just who you are. Since you arrived here, you've had people from different levels coming to you, telling their stories, telling you how much you have touched them. There are many who just don't have that opportunity, who would love to do that. And I want you to know that this country values you, and we at UCT are delighted that you've decided, you've agreed to spend this time with us and share with us our thoughts at this time in the life of our country. We have a little gift for you. As you know, times are tight. The money is tight, we don't have money. If we did, in our culture, a real gift has got 4 legs. But we can't afford the 4 legs, so we have prepared some smaller nyana gift, just so that you remember this time with us. Friends, colleagues, thank you very much for joining us for this VC's lecture. We really appreciate your presence. Have a good evening.